Hi, this is Jake, and I run the chess club at the Creston-Dement Public Library, and I'm glad you're joining me today. This is part 6 of a series of videos that are for complete beginners to the game of chess. Today, we will talk about our final piece, the pawn. Each side starts with 8 pawns, one on each square of each side's second rank, in front of their other pieces. Pawns have a few special rules with their movement, but their basic movement is very simple. Pawns move forward by 1 square. This means that pawns are the only piece that cannot move backward in the game of chess. But let's talk about some exceptions to only being able to move forward by 1 square at a time. Pawns can move forward by 1 square, except when they are on their starting square. They may instead choose to move forward by 2 squares. The other exception to a pawn's basic movement is how they capture, as pawns are the only piece that may not capture using their basic movement. They cannot capture a piece that is directly in front of them. This means that if 2 pawns are staring each other down, neither of them can continue to move forward down the board. Pawns can only capture a piece by moving forward 1 square diagonally. Let's see some examples in play. White will move to d4, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn can move 2 squares from its starting position. Black will move to f6, deciding not to move 2 squares, even though he could. White will move a pawn to c4, again moving 2 squares. And black finally taking advantage of the 2 squares by moving to d5. Now white's d-pawn is blocked and cannot move to d5, but white's c-pawn is in a position to capture this pawn diagonally. So white will capture diagonally. Despite the fact that pawns are one of the slowest and weakest pieces on the board, they are still one of the most important. François-André Danican-Philidor, the greatest player of his time, said in his book, "Pawns are the soul of chess." Part of the reason he might have said this is because of a property that the pawn has that no other piece has. If a pawn manages to make it all the way to the other side of the board, it may become any other piece, except for a king. So keep your pawns safe, and one day they may become a powerful queen to help you devastate your opponent. Let's show this off. We'll say black ignores the pawn on d5. White will move to d6, and again black ignores the pawn. White will move to d7. Black will capture diagonally from c5 to d4. And finally, white will make it to the end of the board and become a queen. A fun way to practice using pawns is to set up the board here, as I have, to only have the pawns on the board and to play a pawn game. The objective of the pawn game is to be the first player to get a pawn to the other side of the board. This game can teach players how pawns can defend each other and also how to create a pawn break to run across the board to win. Also, you can add more pieces slowly to make things more complicated. For example, adding bishops to the mix. With the goal still remaining of just getting a pawn to the other side of the board. Finally, with our last piece being shown, we now know the starting position of all the pieces, and can now see the chessboard in its fully set up state. If you're playing online, the board will be set up for you, but if you want to play with a physical chessboard and want help remembering how to set up the board, I'll tell you the way that I personally remember how to set up the board. First, the pawns are simple, placing them on the second rank. Then, the rooks form the strong outer walls of our fortifications. The knights live inside of these fortifications. The bishops stay close to the king and queen to give them advice. The queen is up to date with all of the latest fashions and always matches her color. And finally, the king takes his place next to his queen. Now, let's repeat for black. First, the pawns go on their second rank. Next, the rooks make the strong outer walls. Then, the knights live inside. The bishops advise the king and queen nearby. The queen, even though this is green, it is the dark square. She matches her color. And the king takes his place. And now you know the very basics of chess. There are still 2 more rules left to cover, but you now know all the basics of how the pieces move. This is all for today's video. Next week, I'll start covering some of these other rules that are a little bit harder to grasp, yet still fundamental rules of the game of chess. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you and your king stay safe.